Welcome to this presentation on simulation of necessary conditions of world peace, leveraging a quaternary-based quintuple-layered complex adaptive systems model. I'm Praveen Malik, and this presentation is based on a paper by the same name submitted to the 30th International Conference on Management of Technology, organized by IAMOT and Nile University. Over the next 15 minutes, I would like to present a brief overview of the concept. And then since we're focusing here on a simulation, I'll draw attention to the initial conditions and setup of the simulation, some of the important boundary conditions within which the scenarios that I'll focus on exist, and then dive into three different kinds of scenarios that generate a range of different outcomes of world peace. And finally, I'll summarize and conclude. So stepping back, this model of world peace is approached in terms of complex adaptive systems theory, which very quickly is a way to look at a system that comprises of a number of autonomous, independent, interacting units where there is no centralized control. In particular, this model of CAS that I've used is quaternary-based and quintuple layered, and I want to draw contrast to many models of CAS that exist that are essentially only single layered. The quaternary basis that I'm going to focus on highlights essentially four organizational principles or four sources of innovation that can be summarized as knowledge, power, service, and harmony. And these are found in CAS in general, as extensive research has shown. The five layers that comprise this complex adaptive systems model are essentially the foundational living cell layer, which is the basis of all living life, the nature-based ecosystem services layer, which provides many diverse services that we take for granted, such as food creation or water filtration or air purification, carbon sequestration, and so on. The third layer is the human dynamics layer. And the fourth layer is essentially due to human dynamics, but is a layer of culture, which then also influences all human-based organizations. And the fifth and final layer is that of countries or nations that typically develop along some unique national genius. So this paper explores a simulation for world peace based on the influence of these four organizational principles or sources of innovation on each of the five interacting layers. And the final point before diving into this is that to avoid extraordinary complexity, this simulation is based on aggregate interaction between the distributed autonomous independent agents, typical to each of the five layers under consideration. That said, let's look at the initial conditions and setup. So this is leveraged using a tool called Insight Maker, and we see here three areas that are called out. There's the central blue area that essentially has the core quintuple layered model. Then you have the green layer, which looks at the quaternary basis of this quintuple layered model. And the quaternary basis, again, is distributed into two components. One is the organizational principles or sources of innovation, which have been summarized here as knowledge, power, service, and harmony. And then the second green layer is essentially calling out the degree to which these sources of innovation are organized so that they can effectively ripple from one layer of the quintuple system to the next. And then finally, you've got the red areas called out, which point to natural sources of volatility and problems that always occur that are many times unexpected. To dive into this in a little more detail, when we look at the core blue area, what we see is a number of feedback loops. And here I only draw attention to some typical feedback loops between the human dynamics layer and its adjacent layers. On one side, the cultural dynamics, on the other, the ecosystem services layer, and then subsequently the country level dynamics and cellular dynamics. But the point here is that there's heavy influence between one and the other, so that if human dynamics operates in a certain way, then cultural dynamics and the ecosystem dynamics are going to be affected by it, and so on. This next picture here essentially focuses on the sources of volatility. So you've got some status quo trends that are typical, that vary, say, between particular lower and upper limits. But then you have, when we ripple through this simulation, you've got the world split up into different regions. So there's variance in volatility and problems that may occur at regional levels, and that's simplified by having a variance of occurring at region A, region B, and region C separately. And then you've got global volatility that also affect how world peace may play out. And I already drew attention to the sources of development, which again are twofold. One is the level of innovation, and the second is the level to which the innovation is organized. So now when we run the simulation, I want to draw attention here to a few different boundary conditions that emerge. And here you'll see in these levers that they're all strung or to the extreme left, showing the minimal possible. And here, if we think about knowledge, power, service, and harmony as a value that can be from -10 to +10, we see that they're all strung to the -10, meaning that there's some kind of minimum development in effect. And then also we see a minimum level of organization, so that whatever this innovation is really not being propagated forward in any organized way. And as a result of this, when we look at world peace, we see that it tends in a mildly negative direction over a period of about 20 years. Now, by contrast, when we look at a second boundary condition where we string the level of organization to the extreme right, so there's a maximum organization and minimum development in terms of sources of innovation, we see that that high level of organization has a very impactful effect, because the level of world peace deteriorates exponentially to a very high negative value. Now, when we contrast that with a third scenario where we have the maximum development or source of innovation that's possible along all four of these dimensions, but then there's a minimum level of organization so that propagation is not organized, then we see that world peace essentially increases mildly and in a positive direction. And finally, when we have everything completely put on the right side so that there's a maximum source of innovation and there's a maximum level of organization, then we see that world peace can grow exponentially over a period of 20 years. Now, I want to draw attention to a few scenarios now that exist between these boundary conditions. So let's consider essentially a scenario where you have an adverse mindset. So there's basically no source of innovation, but in the middle organization. And what this is drawing attention to here is the initial conditions that animate the world situation. And we can see that there's a status quo where it's mildly repeating trends that have occurred either positively or negatively. And that's the initial condition for this world peace. But when we see the play out of this adverse mindset and in the middle organization, we can see that world peace essentially that's being contributed to by these quintuple dynamics. We see that the quintuple dynamics are all negative, and whether it's human dynamics or the ecosystem dynamics, cultural dynamics, the cellular and country level dynamics are all tending towards an accelerated negative outcome. And that's influencing regional flows that also are becoming more negative over a 20-year period, and that influences world peace. So if we look at the relative influence, while we had initial conditions fluctuating between -4 and +4, we have over here quintuple dynamics that go down to -40 relative to where it was initially. And we have regional flows going down to, as a result of the quintuple dynamics, down to a level of -80, -90. And then we have world peace decreasing to a minimum of essentially -140 of what it was. So that's a fairly large jump in negativity. And I'm going to go through these a little bit quicker. When we look at the second scenario of neutral mindset and in the middle organization, then we can see by contrast, and here's what we mean by neutral mindset and in the middle organization. We've got sources of innovation that are essentially zeroed out, so neither negative nor positive. So that's neutral mindset. And then you've got in the middle organization, then we can see that world peace essentially is tending negatively, but only mildly. And when we contrast this to above average organization, so here there's only one lever of the four that's activated, and then you've got above leverage organization or above average organization, then you see that there tends to be a fluctuation of world peace around 0, but then it gets to some negative areas. And then as you have 2 of the 4 activated, then there's more fluctuation. So, but then you see also a greater degree of positive world peace. When 3 of these levers are activated, then essentially you can see that the trend is more positive over a 20-year period and up to a multiple of 30 times. And then when you have all 4 of the sources of innovation and a high degree of organization, you essentially see that you can exponentially increase world peace over a 20-year period. So summarizing, what we've really seen in this simulation is that typical scenarios fall between realities set up by extreme boundary conditions, but there is a significant trend that occurs when more of the 4 sources of innovation are basically activated simultaneously. So with only one of the quaternary bases active, world peace will stumble along in a mildly negative way. With any 2 of the quaternary bases active, world peace will fluctuate between mildly negative and mildly positive values over 20 years. With any of the 3 quaternary bases active, world peace will tend to increase by some multiple of 10 over the course of 20 years. And with all 4 quaternary bases active, essentially also given the high carry forward of organizational integrity, world peace will tend toward exponential positive growth toward the end of 20 years.